the exact sound. That was the moment everything shifted. Closing audience line options. If this story resonated with you, tell me where you're listening from. What boundary do you need to set today? If you've ever been underestimated by your own family, I hope you remember that was never the truth about you. Important guidelines and restrictions. No generic filler. No motivational speech paragraphs in the middle. No over-explaining the moral too early. No unrealistic billionaire nonsense unless properly seeded. No random side characters unless they matter to the payoff. No melodramatic screaming narration. No everyone clapped ending. Keep the story personal, specific, humiliating, strategic, and cathartic. Make the protagonist morally clear but still human. The script must sound channel native to Maiden's Payback. Now create phase 1 for this story. I remember the exact sound of Diane's bracelets clinking against the table that day in the conference room. A nervous habit she had, twisting the gold bangles on her wrist whenever something didn't go according to her plan. She'd been twisting them since the lawyer walked in. I noticed it because noticing things is what I do for a living. People think forensic accounting is about spreadsheets, and it is, but it's also about reading rooms. About catching the half-second delay before someone answers a question they should have answered instantly. But before I get to what happened next in that room, I need to take you back further, because the $1 inheritance didn't come out of nowhere. It was the final entry in a ledger that had been building for over a decade. The first time I really understood where I stood in that house, I was 15. It was Thanksgiving, and my grandmother, my mother's mother, the only blood relative I had left who still treated me like I belonged somewhere, had driven 4 hours to be there. Diane sat her at the end of the table, past the kids' folding chairs, near the kitchen door where the draft came in every time someone walked past. When I quietly moved a place setting to make room for her closer to the family, Diane corrected it back within the hour, smiling the whole time. "I just think it flows better this way," she said. My father didn't say anything. He never said anything in moments like that. I used to tell myself he just didn't notice. Looking back, I think he noticed everything and simply didn't know how to fight a war that quiet. The second example happened when I was 19, home from community college for winter break. I came down with the flu badly enough that I missed 3 days of a part-time retail job I needed to keep my tuition payments current. Diane told my father I was being dramatic and always finding reasons not to contribute. 3 weeks later, Connor totaled the Civic doing donuts in a parking lot with his friends, and Diane spent 45 minutes on the phone explaining to my father why boys make mistakes and why he needed to help Connor cover the deductible. My father paid it. $2,200, no questions asked, no lecture, nothing. I remember doing the math in my head even then, even before it was my job to do that kind of math, and thinking this is what I'm worth and this is what he's worth, and the numbers don't match, and nobody in this house thinks that's strange except me. The third example is the one that still sits heaviest because it involved my mother. After she died, my father kept a small storage unit with her belongings. Her wedding dress, boxes of photographs, a jewelry box that had been her grandmother's. When I was 26, settled into my own apartment, I asked if I could finally go through it, maybe take a few pieces with me. Diane told me almost casually, over a Sunday dinner I'd been invited to more out of obligation than warmth, that the storage unit had been cleared out a while ago. Your dad and I figured nobody was using any of it. She said it the way you'd mention you'd donated old towels. My father sat there and ate his dinner and didn't correct her, didn't explain, didn't apologize. I went to the bathroom, sat on the edge of the tub for 6 minutes, and came back out with my face arranged into something normal, because that's what you learn to do in a house like that. You learn to leave the room to fall apart and come back composed. What they didn't know was that I had quietly kept a list. Not out of bitterness, or not only out of bitterness, but because the part of my brain that does this job for a living doesn't know how to stop collecting evidence, even when the evidence is about my own life. Dollar amounts. Who paid for what? Who was excused for what? It wasn't a plan. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't building a case against my family the way I'd build one against an embezzling CFO. I was just a person who happened to notice patterns. And the pattern in my own home had been screaming at me since I was 15 years old. My father and I had a complicated relationship, but not a cold one, not exactly. He'd call me on my birthday. He came to my CPA licensing ceremony alone, without Diane, and told me afterward in the parking lot that my mother would have been proud of me. His voice cracking in a way I'd only heard once before at her funeral. There were these flickers of the father I remembered from before. Before Diane, before the hierarchy, before the slow erosion of whatever version of family I thought I still had a stake in. But the flickers never lasted. He'd go home to that house, to that dynamic, and the version of him that called me on my birthday would disappear again behind the version of him that let Diane clear out my mother's storage unit without a word. So when Walter Greenfield called me 18 months before my father's death and said, "Your father needs to see you, just you this week if possible," some small, exhausted part of me actually thought, finally. Even though I didn't yet know what finally meant. That meeting changed everything, though not in the way grief usually changes things. I'll get to exactly what was said in that room soon. But first, you need to sit in that conference room with me one more time. At the will reading, in the moment right after Connor's laugh, right before the lawyer reached for a second folder sitting quietly to his left, a folder none of us had been told about. I remember the exact sound of that folder. The particular weight of cardstock against the table. That was the moment everything shifted. If you've ever sat in a room full of people who decided long before you walked in what you were worth, I think you already know the feeling I'm describing. Tell me where you're watching this from. I'd like to know who's still with me before we get to the part where the room goes quiet. Walter Greenfield reached for that second folder slowly, the way a man reaches for something he's been instructed to handle with care. He didn't open it right away. He set it down, squared its edges against the table, and looked up at the room over the rim of his glasses. "Before I continue," he said, "I want to remind everyone that Richard was very specific about the order in which this would be read." Diane stopped twisting her bracelets. I noticed that immediately. The stillness was almost louder than the clinking had been. "Specific how?" Connor asked, and I heard the first thread of uncertainty in his voice, thin but present, like a man who just realized the floor he was standing on might not be as solid as he'd assumed 30 seconds earlier. "You'll see," Walter said, and went back to the main will, finishing the smaller bequests first. A watch to a cousin, a donation to my father's old fishing club, $12,000 split between 2 former employees from his contracting business who'd stayed with him for over 20 years. Diane visibly relaxed during part, I think because none of it touched what she actually cared about. Then Walter reached the section everyone had been waiting for. "To my wife, Diane Vance, I leave the house at 1407 Birchwood Lane, free and clear, along with the contents therein, and a continuation of her monthly allowance from the joint investment account for a period of 18 months. 18 months. I watched Diane's face do something complicated. Relief. Then the faintest flicker of confusion, like she'd expected the word lifetime and gotten a number instead. "To my stepson, Connor Whitfield, I leave $25,000 to be used at his discretion." Connor grinned. $25,000 meant nothing compared to what he'd clearly been expecting. He and Bree had spent the entire car ride over, according to what I overheard in the parking lot beforehand, discussing whether the lake house would go to one of them outright or get sold and split. But $25,000 was still $25,000. And Connor wasn't a man who turned down free money. "To my stepdaughter, Bree Whitfield Marsh, I leave the same $25,000 to be used at her discretion." Bree finally looked up from her nails. And then Walter turned the page, and I watched him glance at me, not unkindly, almost apologetically, before he read the next line. "To my daughter, Naomi Vance, I leave the sum of $1. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds before Connor broke it. $1, he said and laughed. That same open, delighted bark from before, except louder now, like he'd been saving it up. "Oh my God. $1. Naomi, I'm sorry, but..." He turned to Bree, who was smirking now too. I told you this was coming. Connor, Diane said, but there was no real correction in her voice. It was the kind of Connor you say when you want credit for trying to stop something without actually stopping it. No, I'm serious, Connor said, leaning forward, looking directly at me for the first time since I'd sat down. I mean, you basically checked out of this family years ago. You show up for what, Christmas if that? You think Dad didn't notice that you were always too busy with your big important job to come around? This is actually kind of poetic if you think about it. That's enough, my father's attorney said quietly, but Connor wasn't finished. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking, he continued. Dad finally told the truth. $1. That's, Naomi, that's basically him saying, thanks for nothing. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, and I want to tell you honestly what was going through my mind in that moment, because it wasn't rage, even though rage would have been an entirely reasonable response. What I felt was something closer to recognition, like watching a pattern complete itself. Like finally seeing, in full daylight, the exact shape of something I'd spent 19 years only seeing in pieces. Are you done? I asked Connor. My voice came out calm, flat even. I'd spent a career learning how to keep my voice flat while delivering numbers that ended careers and ended marriages and once, memorably, ended a man's freedom for the next 11 years. A laughing 31-year-old in a rented suit wasn't going to be the thing that finally cracked that particular skill. I'm just saying, Connor said again, quieter now, because something in my tone had registered even if he couldn't name what it was. Then let Walter finish, I said, and turned back to the attorney. Walter cleared his throat. There is an additional document, he said, that Richard asked to be read only after the will itself had been fully disclosed, and only in the presence of all named beneficiaries. He reached for the second folder. He was very clear that this needed to happen in this room on this day. In this order, Diane's bracelet started again faster now. He also specified, Walter continued, that this portion be read aloud in full without interruption. He opened the folder. What they didn't know, what none of them in that room had any way of knowing, was that I'd had a version of this moment rehearsed in my mind for 18 months, ever since that quiet meeting in this same building, ever since my father had looked at me across this same table and said words I hadn't fully let myself believe until right now. I remember the exact sound of the page turning. Thin paper, expensive stock, the particular crispness of a document that had been printed once and never touched again. That was the moment everything shifted. Walter began to read, and the room went the kind of quiet that doesn't happen naturally, the kind where you can hear the air conditioning cycle on, where you can hear someone 2 seats over swallow. To Naomi Vance, Walter read. The $1 specified in the preceding will is intentional and should not be misunderstood as my final assessment of your worth, either to me or to this family. It is a legal instrument, included on the advice of counsel, to ensure this document cannot be successfully challenged as having omitted a biological child without cause. The truth is this: every asset of meaningful value that I own, the contracting business, the commercial property on Delford Street, the lake house at Crestline, and the entirety of the Meridian Trust, was transferred into your name 18 months ago, outside of probate, through mechanisms my attorney can explain to you in full once this reading concludes. I heard Diane's chair scrape against the floor before I registered that she'd stood up. That's not, she started and then stopped because Walter held up a single finger, not unkindly but firmly, the universal gesture of a man who has been instructed not to be interrupted and intends to honor that instruction. He asked me to finish, Walter said. Please. Diane sat back down slowly, the way you sit down when your legs have made the decision for you. Walter continued. Naomi, I know you've spent most of your adult life being told, in ways large and small, that you were the afterthought in this family. I let that happen for longer than I should have, and I won't spend this letter making excuses for it because you deserve better than excuses. What I will say is that I watched you build a life entirely on your own merit, with no help from me, and I watched you do it without ever once asking for the help you were entitled to ask for. That told me everything I needed to know about who should be trusted with what I built. He paused, and for the first time, I saw something flicker across his professional composure. The small human cost of reading a dying man's private words out loud to a room full of strangers and family who hadn't earned the right to hear them. "Diane," Walter read, "the house and the allowance are yours as promised, and I hope they're enough to start over with. Connor, Bree, the $25,000 each is real, and it's yours outright. I want all three of you to understand that none of this was punishment. It was correction. For 16 years, the resources in this family flowed in one direction, and I let it happen because it was easier than the alternative. This is the alternative." Connor's face had gone through 3 distinct expressions in under a minute: confusion, disbelief, and now something curdling into anger. "This doesn't make sense," he said, mostly to Diane, mostly under his breath, but loud enough that everyone heard it. "The business is worth. Mom, the business alone is worth like $2 million. The Delford property, $4.2 million combined as of the most recent appraisal," Walter said, not unkindly, reading from a line further down the page. "Plus the trust, which I'm not authorized to disclose the exact value of in this setting, but which Richard described to me as significant." The room did the math out loud, in fragments, in half-finished sentences. Bree had gone pale. Diane's hand was pressed flat against the table like she needed it to stay upright. "He told me everything was split fairly," Diane said, and her voice had lost the polished real estate agent smoothness I'd heard my entire adolescence. Sounded thin now, almost young. "He told me the house and the allowance were the bulk of it. He told me. I told you what I needed you to believe for 18 months, Walter read, and I realized with a small jolt that my father had anticipated this exact moment, this exact protest, and had written the answer to it directly into the letter. Because I needed time to finish the transfers without interference, and I knew, Diane, that if you understood the scale of what was happening, you would have found a way to stop it. The same way you found a way to stop every other thing in this house that didn't benefit you or your children directly. I want to be honest about what I felt hearing those words. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It was something quieter and stranger. The specific, disorienting relief of hearing someone finally say a true thing out loud after a decade of watching everyone around you pretend it wasn't true. "That's enough," Diane said, and now she was standing again, and this time nobody stopped her. He wasn't well at the end, you all saw that, he wasn't himself, this isn't. Walter, you can't seriously be telling me this document is going to hold up. She manipulated him. She's an accountant, for God's sake, she does this for a living, she knows exactly how to. Diane. Walter's voice stayed level, but something in it had hardened. I need to stop you there because what you're describing is a serious allegation, and I want to make sure you understand what you're alleging before you say it again in front of witnesses. Richard executed these documents in this office, in my presence, after a full capacity evaluation conducted by an independent physician at my insistence, specifically because I anticipated this exact conversation. Naomi was not present for the evaluation, the drafting, or the execution of a single page of this trust. I can produce the physician's notes, the video recording of the signing, and Richard's own handwritten letter to her, which I have not yet read, if you'd like to continue down this road. The room went silent again, but it was a different silence than before. The first silence had been shock. This one was something closer to the sound of a door closing. I sat very still through all of it, hands folded, the way I'd sit through a deposition where I already knew the outcome but needed the other side to arrive at it themselves, in their own time, in their own words, so that nobody could later claim they hadn't understood. What they didn't know, I want to say to you now, the way I've said it to myself 100 times since, was that I hadn't known either. Not the scale of it. Not the timing of it. My father had told me 18 months ago in this same room that he was taking care of some things, and that I should trust the process, even when it doesn't make sense yet. I'd signed where Walter told me to sign. I'd asked almost no questions because some part of me, the part that had spent a career reading rooms and reading people, understood that my father needed this to be his decision, made on his terms in his own time, without my fingerprints anywhere on it. I think looking back, that was its own kind of gift. He didn't just leave me an inheritance. He left me a paper trail so clean that nobody could ever credibly claim I'd taken anything that wasn't freely given. Connor turned to me then, and for a moment the bravado was gone entirely, replaced by something closer to genuine confusion. "Did you know about this?" he asked. "This whole time, did you know?" "I knew he was meeting with Walter," I said. "I didn't know what for. He didn't tell me the details. I think he wanted it to land exactly the way it just landed, for everyone including me." Bree started and then didn't finish, because there wasn't really a way to finish that sentence that didn't make things worse for her. Walter closed the folder gently and looked around the room. "There's one more item," he said. "Richard left a personal letter, addressed only to Naomi, that I'm instructed to give to her privately, not to be read in this room. I'd suggest we conclude the formal proceedings here, and I can go over the trust documentation and transfer logistics with Naomi separately at her convenience." Diane was still standing, one hand braced on the table, staring at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before in 16 years. Not the practiced warmth, not the polite condescension, not even the open hostility of moments earlier. Just something raw and unguarded and afraid. "What happens to the house?" she said quietly. It wasn't really a question to the room anymore. It was a question to me. "You keep the house," I said. "And the allowance for 18 months like the will says. That's what he wanted. I'm not going to take that away from you." I watched her absorb that. Watched her try to figure out whether it was kindness or a different kind of power, the kind that doesn't need to take everything to prove it could. "It was both, if I'm honest with you. It was both. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Because 3 days later, while I was sitting in Walter's office going through the actual structure of what my father had built, the business, the trust, the property holdings, Walter's paralegal flagged something in the business accounts that didn't add up. A discrepancy in the contracting company's operating account, dating back almost 4 years. Small at first. Then, the longer I looked, not small at all. I'd spent 9 years finding exactly this kind of thing in other people's businesses. I just never expected to find it in my own father's. I want to tell you something about how forensic accounting actually works, because television gets it wrong almost every time. There's no dramatic music. There's no single smoking gun document that falls out of a file folder. Slow. It's rows and columns. It's a Tuesday afternoon spent reconciling bank statements against invoices, looking for the place where two numbers that should match each other quietly don't. The discrepancy Walter's paralegal flagged was in the operating account for Vance Contracting, my father's business, the one now legally mine. $41,000, paid out over 4 years in increments small enough to avoid triggering the bank's automatic reporting thresholds, to a vendor account listed as Whitfield Property Solutions, LLC. Whitfield. Connor's last name. I didn't say anything to Walter at first. I just asked for full access to the company's banking records, the vendor files, and the QuickBooks login, and I told him I'd need a few days. Took me one. Whitfield Property Solutions, LLC, it turned out, was registered to Connor's home address, formed 4 years and 2 months earlier, about 3 months after Connor had graduated from a 2-year associate's program in business administration and was, according to family conversations I'd half listened to at the time, figuring out his next move. The LLC had no employees, no insurance filings, no actual contracting licenses on record with the state board, which mattered quite a bit, because every single invoice paid to it described subcontracted landscaping and site preparation services for Vance Contracting job sites. I pulled the job site records for the same period. 11 invoices from Whitfield Property Solutions, totaling $41,300, attached to 7 different residential construction projects. I cross-referenced the dates against site supervisor logs. My father had kept meticulous paper logs his entire career. the old-fashioned kind, signed daily by whoever was on site. Not one of those 7 projects showed any subcontracted landscaping crew on site on the dates the invoices claimed. Not one. I sat with that for a long time before I let myself draw the obvious conclusion, because I've learned professionally that the obvious conclusion is sometimes wrong, and you owe it to everyone involved to rule out the boring explanation before you reach for the damning one. Maybe the logs were incomplete. Maybe the work had been done off-book for some innocuous reason. Maybe my father had known and approved it as some informal arrangement nobody had bothered to document properly. So I checked the rest of it. I pulled my father's personal calendar from the same period, which Walter still had access to through the estate's records. On 4 separate dates corresponding to invoice payments, my father had been out of town, once at a contractors' conference in Charlotte, twice on hospital visits during the early rounds of his cancer treatment, once on a fishing trip with the men from the club he'd left money to in his will. Each time, the invoice had been approved and paid by someone with administrative access to the company's accounting software. There were exactly 2 people with that access: my father and Diane, who'd helped manage the books informally for years, a fact I only knew because she'd mentioned it, more than once at family dinners, with a particular kind of pride. "Richard says I keep him organized," she'd say, like it was a charming personality trait instead of a financial responsibility. I didn't go to Walter with a theory. I went to him with a spreadsheet, 11 rows, dates, amounts, cross-referenced against site logs and my father's calendar, with the gaps highlighted in a flat, unemotional red. That's the part of my job I'm actually good at. Not the confrontation. The documentation. Making something true so undeniable that the confrontation becomes almost unnecessary by the time it happens. What they didn't know, I think now looking back, was that I wasn't looking for this. I genuinely wasn't. I'd gone into that office to understand the scope of what my father had left me. The trust structure, the commercial property, the logistics of stepping into ownership of a business I'd have to learn to run. I found this because it was sitting there, in plain accounting language, waiting for someone with the right eyes to look at it the right way. My father had spent his last 18 months making sure the right person would have those eyes. Walter looked at the spreadsheet for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Do you want to know what I think this is?" "I already know what it is," I said. "I just want to know what we're legally allowed to do about it." Because here's the thing I understood sitting in that office that I don't think Diane or Connor ever fully grasped about. Who I'd become in the years they'd written off as me being too busy for family. I wasn't angry in the way that makes people reckless. I was angry in the way that makes people precise. $41,000 siphoned out of a business that now belonged to me, through a shell LLC registered to my stepbrother's address, approved by my stepmother during periods when my dying father was out of town getting chemotherapy. That wasn't a moral failing I needed to feel something about. It was a financial crime with a documented timeline and a clear paper trail. And I had spent my entire career being the person who turns exactly that kind of documentation into consequences. Walter, to his credit, didn't try to talk me into anything or out of anything. He just asked the practical question. "What do you want to do?" "Nothing for now," I said. "I want to keep pulling the thread before anyone knows it's been found." Because that's the other thing about this kind of work. The moment the people involved know you found something, they start covering it. Documents disappear. Stories get rehearsed. The cleanest version of the truth is always the one you collect before anyone has time to prepare a defense against it. So over the next 11 days, while Diane and Connor believed the will reading was behind us and the family had simply, quietly fractured the way families do, I did what I do for a living. I requested the full banking history for Whitfield Property Solutions through the Public Business Registry, which gave me its formation documents, its registered agent, and confirmation that Connor was its sole listed member. I cross-referenced the LLC's own bank deposits against the dates of the Vance contracting payments, confirming the money had landed directly in an account Connor controlled, not some intermediary, not some legitimate pass-through. I requested copies of the 7 job site contracts from clients directly through Walter, framed simply as estate transition paperwork, which clients are legally required to provide and which none of the clients had any reason to refuse, since none of them were under suspicion of anything. Every single client confirmed they'd never hired or seen a landscaping subcontractor on their property. By the 11th day, I had a complete, airtight, fully sourced documentation trail showing that $41,300 had been embezzled from my father's company over 4 years through a fraudulent vendor relationship, approved by Diane during a period when she held limited administrative access to the company's financial systems, with the funds landing in an LLC solely controlled by Connor. That should have felt like enough. For most people, I think it would have been. But I want to tell you about one more thing I found on day 11 almost by accident while closing out the file, because this was the detail that changed what I decided to do next, and changed it from a financial recovery into something closer to a reckoning. Buried in the same QuickBooks file, in a transaction memo field nobody usually bothers to read, attached to a payment dated 3 weeks after my mother's storage unit had supposedly been cleared out, the unit Diane told me years ago over Sunday dinner had simply been disposed of because nobody was using any of it. There was a single line. A payment of $380 to a self-storage facility 2 towns over, under Diane's name, not my father's. A unit that, according to the facility's public rental records, which Walter was able to subpoena once I flagged it, was still active, still being paid for, monthly, for the past 8 years. I remember the exact sound of my own breath catching when I read that line. Not the money. The money was almost beside the point by then. It was the realization that Diane hadn't disposed of my mother's belongings at all. She'd moved them quietly to a unit under her own name, and kept paying for it year after year, while telling a grieving 26-year-old that there was nothing left to inherit from her own mother. I didn't know why yet. I had theories. Resale value, spite, some complicated need to keep a piece of leverage over a marriage she'd never felt fully secure in. But I didn't need to know why. I needed to know where. And now I did. That was the moment everything shifted. Not the will reading, not the $4.2 million, not even the embezzlement. This was the moment the story stopped being about an inheritance and became about something I could no longer afford to handle quietly, the way I'd planned to handle the rest of it. I closed my laptop, sat in Walter's office in the early evening light, and made a decision I want to be honest with you about. It would have been easy in that moment to call Diane and scream at her, to drive to that storage facility and break the lock myself. Thought about it. I'm not going to pretend the thought didn't cross my mind, because I think pretending to be a perfectly calm, unbothered narrator at every single moment of this story would make me sound less like a person and more like a fictional character, and I'd rather you trust me than admire me. But I didn't do either of those things. Instead, I picked up my phone, and I called the one person whose entire profession exists for exactly this kind of moment. Not Walter, who handled estates, but a former colleague of mine who'd moved from forensic accounting into private investigation work, specializing in exactly the kind of asset recovery and evidentiary documentation that turns a strong suspicion into a courtroom-ready case. I need you to do something for me, I told her, quietly. And I need you to start tomorrow. I want to tell you something about how forensic accounting actually works, because television gets it wrong almost every time. There's no dramatic music. There's no single smoking gun document that falls out of a file folder. Slow. It's rows and columns. It's a Tuesday afternoon spent reconciling bank statements against invoices, looking for the place where 2 numbers that should match each other quietly don't. The discrepancy Walter's paralegal flagged was in the operating account for Vance Contracting, my father's business, the one now legally mine. $41,000, paid out over 4 years in increments small enough to avoid triggering the bank's automatic reporting thresholds, to a vendor account listed as Whitfield Property Solutions, LLC. Whitfield. Connor's last name. I didn't say anything to Walter at first. I just asked for full access to the company's banking records, the vendor files, and the QuickBooks login, and I told him I'd need a few days. Took me one. Whitfield Property Solutions, LLC, it turned out, was registered to Connor's home address, formed 4 years and 2 months earlier, about 3 months after Connor had graduated from a 2-year associate's program in business administration and was, according to family conversations I'd half listened to at the time, figuring out his next move. The LLC had no employees, no insurance filings, no actual contracting licenses on record with the state board, which mattered quite a bit, because every single invoice paid to it described subcontracted landscaping and site preparation services for Vance contracting job sites. I pulled the job site records for the same period. 11 invoices from Whitfield Property Solutions, totaling $41,300, attached to 7 different residential construction projects. I cross-referenced the dates against site supervisor logs. My father had kept meticulous paper logs his entire career, the old-fashioned kind, signed daily by whoever was on site. Not one of those 7 projects showed any subcontracted landscaping crew on site on the dates the invoices claimed. Not one. I sat with that for a long time before I let myself draw the obvious conclusion, because I've learned professionally that the obvious conclusion is sometimes wrong, and you owe it to everyone involved to rule out the boring explanation before you reach for the damning one. Maybe the logs were incomplete. Maybe the work had been done off-book for some innocuous reason. Maybe my father had known and approved it as some informal arrangement nobody had bothered to document properly. So I checked the rest of it. I pulled my father's personal calendar from the same period, which Walter still had access to through the estate's records. On 4 separate dates corresponding to invoice payments, my father had been out of town, once at a contractors' conference in Charlotte, twice on hospital visits during the early rounds of his cancer treatment, once on a fishing trip with the men from the club he'd left money to in his will. Each time, the invoice had been approved and paid by someone with administrative access to the company's accounting software. There were exactly 2 people with that access: my father and Diane, who'd helped manage the books informally for years, a fact I only knew because she'd mentioned it more than once at family dinners, with a particular kind of pride. "Richard says I keep him organized," she'd say, like it was a charming personality trait instead of a financial responsibility. I didn't go to Walter with a theory. I went to him with a spreadsheet, 11 rows, dates, amounts, cross-referenced against site logs and my father's calendar, with the gaps highlighted in a flat, unemotional red. That's the part of my job I'm actually good at. Not the confrontation. The documentation. Making something true so undeniable that the confrontation becomes almost unnecessary by the time it happens. What they didn't know, I think now looking back, was that I wasn't looking for this. I genuinely wasn't. I'd gone into that office to understand the scope of what my father had left me. The trust structure, the commercial property, the logistics of stepping into ownership of a business I'd have to learn to run. I found this because it was sitting there, in plain accounting language, waiting for someone with the right eyes to look at it the right way. My father had spent his last 18 months making sure the right person would have those eyes. Walter looked at the spreadsheet for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Do you want to know what I think this is?" "I already know what it is," I said. "I just want to know what we're legally allowed to do about it." Because here's the thing I understood sitting in that office, that I don't think Diane or Connor ever fully grasped about who I'd become in the years they'd written off as me being too busy for family. I wasn't angry in the way that makes people reckless. I was angry in the way that makes people precise. $41,000 siphoned out of a business that now belonged to me, through a shell LLC registered to my stepbrother's address, approved by my stepmother during periods when my dying father was out of town getting chemotherapy. That wasn't a moral failing I needed to feel something about. It was a financial crime with a documented timeline and a clear paper trail. And I had spent my entire career being the person who turns exactly that kind of documentation into consequences. Walter, to his credit, didn't try to talk me into anything or out of anything. He just asked the practical question. "What do you want to do?" "Nothing for now," I said. "I want to keep pulling the thread before anyone knows it's been found." Because that's the other thing about this kind of work. The moment the people involved know you found something, they start covering it. Documents disappear. Stories get rehearsed. The cleanest version of the truth is always the one you collect before anyone has time to prepare a defense against it. So over the next 11 days, while Diane and Connor believed the will reading was behind us and the family had simply, quietly fractured the way families do, I did what I do for a living. I requested the full banking history for Whitfield Property Solutions through the Public Business Registry, which gave me its formation documents, its registered agent, and confirmation that Connor was its sole listed member. I cross-referenced the LLC's own bank deposits against the dates of the Vance contracting payments, confirming the money had landed directly in an account Connor controlled, not some intermediary, not some legitimate pass-through. I requested copies of the 7 job site contracts from clients directly, through Walter, framed simply as. Her name was Priya, and we'd started at the same firm 12 years earlier. 2 analysts sharing a cubicle wall, eating sad desk lunches while we learned how to read a balance sheet like other people read a novel. She'd left the corporate world 4 years ago to start her own investigative practice, the kind that gets hired by divorce attorneys and insurance companies and, occasionally, by people like me. "Walk me through it again," she said, the morning after my call, sitting across from me at a coffee shop 2 towns away from anywhere either of us was known. Slowly. From the beginning. I walked her through it. The will reading. The 18-month gap. The discrepancy in the operating account. Whitfield Property Solutions. The 11 invoices, the 7 job sites, the storage unit under Diane's name. I laid it out the way I'd lay out a case file for opposing counsel. Clean, sequential, no editorializing. Priya didn't say much while I talked. She took notes in a small spiral notebook, the kind you can't subpoena metadata off of, which I noticed because that's exactly the kind of thing I notice now. When I finished, she sat back and said, "Okay. Here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to do anything that gives either of them a reason to start destroying records or moving money. That means no confrontation, no accusatory phone calls, no posting anything anywhere, no telling extended family. Everything happens through paper, through subpoena power where we have it, and through patience." "That's exactly what I want," I said. "Good," she said. "Because here's what most people get wrong about this kind of situation. They want the moment. The confrontation, the gotcha. The scene where the guilty person's face falls and everyone finally sees the truth. But the moment doesn't convict anyone. The paperwork does. So we're going to spend the next few weeks being extremely boring. I want to walk you through what extremely boring actually looked like, because I think this is the part of stories like mine that usually gets skipped over in favor of the satisfying ending, and I don't think that's fair to anyone who might actually be sitting where I was sitting, trying to figure out what to do with evidence of harm inside their own family. The first thing we did was secure the embezzlement case on a track entirely separate from anything emotional. Walter, as the estate's attorney and now as counsel for Vance Contracting under my ownership, formally engaged a forensic auditor. A second independent set of eyes, specifically so that nobody could later claim I'd built or manipulated the case myself, given my professional background and obvious personal stake. The independent auditor reviewed my spreadsheet, the bank records, the client confirmations, and the LLC registry data over 6 days, and came back with a formal written finding. $41,300 in fraudulent vendor payments, consistent with embezzlement, with a documented paper trail connecting the scheme to 2 specific individuals. With that independent finding in hand, Walter filed a civil claim against the business entity Whitfield Property Solutions, LLC, and against Connor personally as its sole member, seeking restitution plus interest. Civil, not criminal at first. I made that choice deliberately. I wasn't interested in watching my stepbrother go to prison over $41,000. Mostly because I understood by then that the money itself was never really the point. The point was making sure nobody in that family could keep pretending none of this had happened. The second thing we did took longer, and it was the part one found harder to sit with because it involved my mother. Priya spent 9 days quietly confirming the details of the storage unit, verifying through the facility's records, obtained through a subpoena Walter filed as part of the estate's broader asset recovery process, that the unit had indeed been rented continuously under Diane's name for 8 years, with monthly payments of $38, then later $52 after a rate increase, drawn from an account that was, notably, not the joint account she shared with my father, but a separate personal account in her name only, the kind of account, Priya pointed out, that people maintain specifically when they want a layer of distance between themselves and a particular financial decision. This is the part one need you to think carefully about, Priya told me the day she brought me the confirmed findings. Legally, this unit and its contents were never actually disposed of, which means they may still be considered part of your mother's estate, or, depending on how your father's will was structured at the time, potentially part of his estate too, since he never formally disclaimed any interest in them. You have a real legal claim to access and recover the contents. But I want to be honest with you, once we move on this, once a subpoena or a formal estate claim goes in for that unit, Diane will know immediately that you know. There's no quiet way to open a locked storage unit that someone else has secretly maintained for 8 years. I sat with that for 2 days before deciding. What ultimately made the decision for me wasn't strategy. It was a single photograph Priya had been able to obtain from the facility's incident log, a routine entry from 3 years earlier, when a leak in an adjacent unit had required staff to briefly inventory the contents of neighboring units to check for water damage. Included in that incident report, filed and quietly archived, was a one-line description of the unit's contents. Boxes, women's clothing, framed photographs, jewelry box. Confirmation, in a stranger's dry administrative language, that everything Diane told me had been thrown away 19 years ago had simply been sitting 11 miles from my apartment the entire time I grieved its absence. I called Walter the next morning and asked him to file the formal estate claim for access to the unit, citing the incident report as supporting documentation. 3 days later, the facility was legally required to grant access to a representative of the estate. Me. Accompanied, at my request, by Walter and by a notary to formally document the inventory as it was recovered. I didn't tell Diane. I didn't need to. The facility's policy required notifying the account holder of any third-party access request, which meant she found out the same week I did the only way she was ever going to find out. Through paperwork, through a notice in the mail, the same bloodless, procedural channel through which she'd quietly maintained that unit for 8 years without anyone the wiser. She called me 3 times that week. I didn't pick up. Not out of cruelty, I want to be clear about that, because I don't think cruelty was ever really the engine behind anything I did during this period. I didn't pick up because I needed the inventory completed and documented before I had any conversation with her at all, and because I'd learned professionally that emotional conversations conducted before the facts are fully secured tend to produce exactly the kind of confused, contradictory, easily deniable exchanges that make accountability impossible later. If she wanted to explain herself, she could explain herself to Walter, on the record, in writing. The 4th call came with a voicemail. I listened to it once, standing in my kitchen on a Thursday evening. Her voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Not the smooth real estate cadence, not the brittle defensiveness from the will reading. Just tired. I don't expect you to understand, she said. I know how it looks. I'll explain when you're ready to hear it. I never threw any of it away, Naomi. I want you to know that much, whatever else you think of me. I saved the voicemail. I didn't delete it, and I didn't call her back yet either. I wanted to see the inventory first, with my own eyes, before I let anyone's explanation shape what I felt about it. The recovery happened on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Walter met me at the facility at 9, along with a notary, a woman named Renata who'd clearly done this kind of careful, sensitive inventory work before and handled the whole process with a gentleness I hadn't expected and was grateful for. The unit door rolled up on 11 boxes, neatly stacked, labeled in Diane's handwriting. Not careless handwriting, not the handwriting of someone disposing of something they didn't care about, but careful block letters, photos, winter clothes, jewelry. Do not open W/ON. The last label stopped me cold. Do not open without N. She'd labeled a box with my initial. 8 years ago, or some point since, she'd specifically set aside my mother's jewelry box and marked it as something that belonged to me, something not to be touched without me present. I didn't understand it yet. I want to be honest about that too. I didn't walk out of that storage unit with some neat, satisfying realization that Diane had secretly been protecting my inheritance out of some hidden well of love I'd simply failed to notice for 19 years. The embezzlement was still real. The 18 years of small humiliations were still real. The lie about clearing it out was still a lie, regardless of what was actually written on a cardboard box. But it complicated something in me that I hadn't expected to be complicated by that point in the story. And I think that complication is part of why what happened next unfolded the way it did, instead of unfolding the way Connor's $41,300 problem unfolded. That should have been the end of the quiet phase. It wasn't, not quite yet. Because 2 weeks later, the civil filing against Whitfield Property Solutions came back from Connor's attorney with a response I hadn't anticipated, and it changed the shape of everything that came next. Connor's attorney's response landed in Walter's inbox on a Monday, 11 pages long, and the core of it was this: Connor wasn't denying the payments. He was claiming my father had verbally authorized them as informal compensation for site cleanup work Connor genuinely believed he'd performed, and that any discrepancy between the invoices and the site logs was simply sloppy paperwork on a small family business that had never been run with airtight documentation practices. It was, I'll admit, a more sophisticated defense than I expected from Connor, which told me his attorney, not Connor, had built it. And it might have actually held up, if not for one thing Connor's attorney clearly didn't know existed when they filed it. My father kept a private journal. Not a diary in the sentimental sense, a job journal, the kind a lot of contractors from his generation kept, recording site visits, client conversations, and notes to himself about the business. Walter had found it while inventorying my father's office at the commercial property on Delford Street, sealed in a drawer, and had set it aside as personal property rather than business records, not realizing its relevance until I specifically asked whether any of my father's handwritten notes from the relevant 4-year period still existed. In an entry dated 14 months before his death, written in the same steady handwriting I remembered from checkbook lessons at our kitchen table, my father had written, "Found a vendor charge from Whitfield Property Solutions I don't recognize. Asked Diane about it. She said it's Connor doing landscaping cleanup. Said she'd been approving them to help him build up some income while he figures out his next step. Told her I wasn't comfortable approving vendor payments for work I haven't personally verified, even for family, especially for family. Asked her to stop until I could review the invoices myself. She said she would." The entry was dated. Notarized copies of 3 more entries over the following 8 months showed my father raising the same concern twice more, each time apparently being told the issue had been resolved. It hadn't been. The payments continued for another 2 years and 7 months after his first documented objection. That journal didn't just dismantle Connor's defense. It dismantled Diane's position entirely because it proved, in my father's own handwriting, that she had been explicitly told to stop authorizing the payments and had continued anyway, which moved the entire situation from informal family arrangement gone unverified into something a prosecutor could credibly describe as knowing, continued fraud. Walter forwarded the journal entries to Connor's attorney along with an amended filing. 11 days later, Connor's attorney withdrew. 8 days after that, Connor signed a settlement agreement. Full restitution of the $41,300 plus accrued interest, payable over 18 months, and a formal admission of liability that closed the door on any future claim he might try to make against the estate or the business. He never apologized to me directly. I want to be honest about that too, because I think real stories rarely end with the clean, cathartic apology scene people want. What I got instead was a signed legal document and 18 months of automatic monthly payments landing in the business account, which, professionally speaking, I've come to understand is the only apology that actually matters in situations like this. People can say sorry and mean nothing by it. Restitution, by contrast, is sorry translated into a language that can't lie. Diane's situation resolved differently, and more slowly. The journal entries put her in a position where Walter, acting now in his capacity as counsel for the estate and the business, was obligated to refer the matter to the company's insurer and, given the documented pattern of repeated, knowing approval of fraudulent payments, to flag it for the district attorney's financial crimes unit as well. I want to be clear that I didn't make that call personally. Walter did, as a matter of professional and legal obligation once the documentation existed, and I didn't try to stop him, because by that point I understood that protecting Diane from consequences she'd earned wasn't actually kindness. It was just a different, quieter version of the same pattern that had let her get away with things in that house for 16 years. The DA's office reviewed the file and ultimately declined to pursue criminal charges against Diane directly, given her position as an approving party rather than the direct recipient of funds, and given her cooperation once the investigation became formal. She gave a full statement, didn't contest the journal entries, and didn't fight the civil findings. But the business insurer's fraud investigation did trigger something else. Under the terms of my father's will, the 18-month allowance Diane had been promised was structured through a trust provision that included a standard, fairly common clause, one Walter had drafted years earlier, long before any of this surfaced, voiding continued allowance payments in the event the recipient was found to have committed fraud against the estate or any business asset within it. Diane's attorney argued the clause shouldn't apply since she hadn't been criminally charged. Walter, citing the civil findings and her own signed statement acknowledging she'd continued approving the payments after being told to stop, disagreed. A judge agreed with Walter. Diane kept the house. That part of the will stood, untouched, exactly as my father had written it, because I never asked anyone to challenge it and wouldn't have supported it if they had. But the allowance stopped 11 months early, and word of the civil judgment and the fraud referral made its way, the way these things always do in a town small enough that everyone's social circles overlap, through the same real estate network Diane had built her career and her social standing on for 2 decades. She didn't lose her house. She lost the version of herself that smiled in that conference room, certain she'd already won. As for the storage unit, I never got the full explanation Diane promised in that voicemail, not really. We did eventually talk, once, 4 months after the will reading, at a coffee shop neither of us had any history with. She told me in a voice with none of its old polish that she'd kept the unit because some part of her had known, even 16 years into the marriage, that she'd never fully be allowed to call that house her own home with my mother's things sitting in it as a kind of permanent ghost, and getting rid of them felt cruel in a way she couldn't bring herself to actually do, so she'd split the difference, told everyone it was gone, kept paying to make sure it wasn't. I don't know if that's the whole truth. I'm an accountant, not a mind reader, and I've learned that people's real motives are rarely as clean as the explanations they eventually settle on once they've had time to make peace with their own choices. But I believed enough of it to stop being angry about that particular piece of it, even while everything else stayed exactly as complicated as it was. I recovered the jewelry box myself, alone, 2 days after the inventory. My mother's wedding ring was still inside it, along with a small gold locket I hadn't seen since I was 11 years old, with a photograph of the two of us, taken at a beach I no longer remember the name of, folded inside ending /emotional resolution. People ask me sometimes whether I regret any of it. The journal entries, the subpoena, the 11 days I spent quietly building a case against my own family while they thought the worst was already behind them. You don't. But I also don't think of any of it as revenge, not really, even though I understand why it looks that way from the outside. What I actually feel, more than a year out from that conference room, is something closer to clarity. For 19 years I measured my worth against a number Diane and Connor never had to think twice about. A car, a storage unit, a seat at the table, and I let that number define how much space I was allowed to take up in my own family. The $1 in that will could have been the final confirmation of everything I already believed about my place in that house. Instead, it turned out to be the last lie a dying man told a room full of people, so the truth could finally land exactly where it was supposed to. I run the business now. Vance Contracting still carries my father's name on the trucks, and I haven't changed that, because some inheritances are worth keeping exactly as they were given. I see Diane occasionally, at a distance, in the way you see people who used to be family and now are just history you happen to share a town with. Connor and I haven't spoken since the settlement. But I have my mother's ring. I have a locket with a photograph of a beach I'm slowly starting to remember the name of again. And I have a quiet, steady understanding that the people who decide what you're worth before you've even sat down at the table are very rarely the ones who get the final say. If you've ever been underestimated by your own family, I hope you remember that was never the truth about you. It was only ever the truth about them. If this story resonated with you, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and finally telling the truth, I'd like to hear which one you chose.